Welcome to Sleepy Story Series, where history drifts gently into dreams. Here, we travel through time not with haste, but with calm footsteps. Each story is a quiet journey through forgotten worlds, great civilizations, and the soft whispers of the past. So, settle in, let your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts drift as we begin tonight's journey. One that will carry you across centuries and into the heart of a story that lingers long after the last word fades. The night air along the Great Wall is thin and still, carrying the scent of stone and pine. Far above the valleys, the wall winds over ridges and across mountain passes, its surface pale under the touch of moonlight. It moves with the land, climbing steep hills, dropping into shadowed ravines, and rising again like the back of a sleeping dragon. For as far as the eye can see, it is there, a line between one world and another. In the quiet of the night, it is easy to imagine this place as eternal. The stones seem rooted in the mountains themselves, their edges softened by centuries of rain and wind. The mortar holds firm, though lichens cling to its surface, marking the slow passage of time. The air is crisp, and the wind carries with it a faint whistle as it brushes through the arrow slits in the watchtowers. No voices, no movement, only the quiet hum of the landscape breathing in the dark. But the stillness is deceptive. This wall was not built for peace. Every curve, every tower, every battlement is a reminder of conflict, of the constant watch kept over the horizon. Once, this place was alive with the sounds of armor clinking, the murmur of voices in the cold, the sudden bark of orders when a shadow appeared on the step. Soldiers stood here, gazing into the darkness, knowing that beyond those hills lay a world that did not always respect borders. The Great Wall has always been more than a physical barrier. For those inside, it was a promise that danger could be held at a distance. For those outside, it was a statement that the land within was protected by power, by wealth, by will. The wall could be seen from miles away, its towers lit with fires that signaled warning across the night. It was meant to be a deterrent, a message written in stone and mortar, yet history tells us that no wall, no matter how long or strong, can be absolute. The Great Wall was crossed time and again, not only by armies, but by traders, refugees, and wanderers. Sometimes the wall failed because of sheer force, sometimes because of human choice. A gate opened in exchange for gold, a bribe, or a promise. Other times, it was not breached at all, but simply bypassed, for even the longest wall cannot cover every mountain, every river, every stretch of wilderness. Standing here in the moonlight, one can almost hear the footsteps of those who have walked this path across the centuries, the builders who carried stones on their backs, the sentries who shivered through winter nights, the messengers who galloped from tower to spread warnings. The wall remembers them all, before it became the symbol we know today, stretching for thousands of kilometers across the north of China. It began as something smaller, scattered fortifications, short stretches of earth and wood, raised not by a single empire, but by many smaller kingdoms. These early walls were born of fear and necessity, a way to mark a line and say, "This is ours." In time, those lines would be connected, strengthened, and transformed into one of the largest human-made structures on Earth. But its story begins not with grandeur, but with fragments, pieces of defense scattered across a land constantly, shifting between war and an easy peace. And so, to understand why the Great Wall could never keep everyone out, we must travel back to those earliest days, when the idea of a wall began as nothing more than a line in the dirt. Before there was A great wall. There were many small ones, like scattered stitches on a vast, fraying cloak. Long before a single emperor dreamed of unifying stones from sea to desert, the northern frontier of ancient China was a patchwork of earthen ramparts, timber palisades, ditches, and beacon hills raised by rival states that looked anxiously toward the grasslands beyond. Each wall was an answer to a question that never slept. How do you mark a line where the horizon keeps moving? In the centuries we now call the Warring States period, the land was a quilt of competing kingdoms: Qin in the far west, Zhao and Yan to the north, Wei and Han and Che spread like islands of authority. They fought one another with the stubbornness of neighbors and watched the north with the caution of farmers eyeing a storm. From the steppe rode swift horse archers, Zhonglu confederations and earlier nomadic bands whose power lay not in heavy armor, but in mobility, timing, and the Great Plains' open hand. Raids could be sudden, here and gone, like wine that scatters chaff. A wall was not only a barrier, it was a habit. States raised ramparts of tamped earth, rammed layer by layer, brown and strong, crowned with wooden stakes. In high places, they shaped beacon platforms, where dry reeds, wolf dung, or oiled brush could make a smoke signal seen for a day's march. A watchman's task was simple and endless: scan the pale distance, count riders, judge dust, light the warning. One tower spoke to another, one state spoke to the next. Across ridgelines, a chain of fire could run faster than any messenger on foot. Imagine a morning on one of those early walls. The light lifts slowly over a field of thorn and feathergrass. A young conscript from Zhao rubs sleep from his eyes and walks the crest path with a bundle of kindling over his shoulder. Frost crisps the surface of the tamped earth. Below him, a ditch glints. Beyond it, fields slope away to a river that is half ice, half breath. He passes a timber gate where two oxen stand steaming in their own quiet. He does not know grand strategy. He knows the cold in his fingers, the weight of the water skins he carries up the stairs, the smell of the beacon basket when the wind shifts. He knows that if 9 riders blur out of the steppe and his captain says, "Now," he must touch flame to straw and feel the heat kick his face. These first walls were practical, local, and imperfect. They bent to the land as a farmer's furrow does. They took advantage of gullies and sandstone spurs. Where a river ran thick in spring, a palisade could stop a raid by narrowing the crossing. Where a pass threaded a mountain, an earthen bank could force riders into a choke point where foot soldiers might hold. But walls could never be everywhere. Gaps were not accidents, so much as arithmetic. A state could not wall every mile and still plant, forge, and feed, because walls cost more than earth and wood. They demanded time, hands, and the season's patience. Men who tamped clay could not harvest grain that same day. Women who braided rope and baked bricks for gatehouses would feel the ache in their backs when the snow set in. Governors weighed ledgers against horizons and asked themselves, how much wall is enough to deter a raid, but not enough to starve a winter? Even then, people understood the double life of a wall. It defended, yes, but it also declared. A ridge crowned with ramparts told a neighbor, "This far." It told local farmers, "Stay, plant, we are watching." It told chiefs on the grassland, "You will be seen if you come this way." And in quiet moments, it told the sentry himself, "You belong to something larger than your fear." Yet the riders learned the wall's grammar too. They studied where beacon chains were thin, where a river flooded a ditch and made the bank soft, where a garrison rotated home at month's end, and the new unit had not yet learned the ravines. They learned the economy of night snow, how it swallowed hoofbeats and hid numbers, and the economy of gifts, a sack of salt, a string of cowries, a promise whispered at a gate. A wall is made of matter, a gate is made of decisions, because these were state walls, not a single civilization's skin. Where Zhao's earthwork ended, Yan's might not begin for a day's march. A canyon would fan the border into 3 branches, and somewhere between branch and branch, a goat path slipped north. Traders found these paths first, then peddlers of news, then the quieter traffic of risk and desire. If a winter was hard on the steppe, a band might ride south, not to conquer, but to barter for barley. If a year was kind, a caravan might come laden with felt and horses, furs and tails, and find the gate captain more interested in a future cousin than in protocol. Still, the habit of walls deepened. Each raid that slipped through encouraged another stake, another lay attempt. Each season of peace expanded a line, just a little farther. Beacon after beacon rose like a string of lanterns hung against the dark. And in the west, a different habit took root, a habit of unification. The kingdom of Qin sharpened itself on discipline and law, building roads that ran like taut bowstrings from capital to frontier. Its leaders saw the frontier not as a quilt of edges, but as a single hem that might be stitched at last. But before that unifying hand arrived, there were long winters when nothing moved but crows and smoke, and long summers when dust devils walked the steppe like thin, curious giants. There were evenings when a watchman leaned on his spear and listened to the frogs in the ditch and let his shoulders drop, thinking of a village far south where his mother kept a small shrine lit for him. There were dawns when cloud and ground were the same pale color, and a single rider appeared as if drawn out of the fog by a careful brush. He would halt, lift his hand, and wait. A wall held that moment, the distance between a greeting and a warning. The first walls taught every lesson the Great Wall would learn later at scale. That terrain is a partner, that logistics is a general, that morale can make a low bank high and a strong bastion frail, that information, a curl of smoke at the right moment, can turn a raid aside without a sword drawn. They also taught the oldest lesson, that the line between inside and outside is a living thing, shaped not only by stone and soil, but by seasons, needs, and the plain. Arithmetic of hunger. When later storytellers speak of a single serpent of masonry running from sea to desert, they compress centuries into a symbol. The truth under that symbol is quieter and more human. Villages that hold clay in woven baskets. Overseers who measured a day's progress in paces and callous palms. Engineers who learned how frost heaves crack an embankment, and how spring thaws swallow a palisade post. The wall began as a tension made visible, a long, patient looking north, and in time, a single wall would gather these patient glances into a stare so steady that stones seemed to grow from mountains. One ruler would imagine a border not as a row of neighbors' fences, but as an unbroken thought in the landscape. He would ask for the impossible and receive something close to it, at a cost his subjects paid with breath and bone. But that is the next turning in our quiet road, the moment a vision becomes a command, and scattered stitches begin to bind. Close your eyes and picture the early ramparts in the last light, a brown line holding a hilltop while cranes lift off the river below. Hear a watchman's cough, the creak of leather, the small crackle of a beacon brazier testing the evening air. The world is not yet a single wall. It is many small answers to the same question. And somewhere beyond the ridge, hoofbeats are already measuring the distance between them. By the time the first emperor of a unified China rose to power, the land north of the Yellow River had already been stitched with walls built by different states. They were scattered, irregular, and each bore the signature of the kingdom that raised it. Zhao's earth mounds sloped differently than Yan's. Qin's timber gates swung heavier than Wei's. None of these walls connected. They stood like separate thoughts along the same horizon. Into 21 BCE, Yingzheng, king of Qin, had done what no ruler before him had achieved, brought the warring states under one crown. He renamed himself Qin Shi Huang, first August emperor, and set about reshaping the land into a single body. Roads ran out from the capital like veins. Weights and measures were made uniform, written characters standardized. But the frontier was still ragged. The emperor's mind worked onto scales at once, the immediate and the eternal. He thought like a man who feared rebellion in the next season, and like a god who imagined his realm enduring for 10,000 generations. The north was his whirring. There, beyond the bend of the Yellow River, lay the open steppe, and on it, the Zhonglu horsemen, swift as wind, hard as frost. They could strike a border village and vanish before the imperial army even saddled its horses. Qin Shi Huang looked at the scattered walls and saw not a collection of barriers, but a single opportunity. If they could be joined, stitched with new sections, fortified with stone, anchored by watchtowers, they could form a spine to the empire's skull. It would not just protect, it would announce the new unity to friend and foe alike. The command went out. Labor was summoned from every province: soldiers, conscripts, prisoners, farmers whose fields would wait until the next planting. They came, with baskets, spades, chisels, and ropes. Some came willingly, proud to serve in this grand work. Others came because refusal was unthinkable. The work began in the west, where Qin's own walls stood. Sections that followed mountain ridges were extended, weaving toward the old lines of Zhao and Yan. The builders tamped turf where stone was scarce, laid heavy blocks where quarries were close, and cut timber from distant forests to span gullies and gate passes. The emperor's orders were relentless. The wall must rise before the year's end, before the snows, before the grass returned to feed the nomad herds. In the dry air of the north, men worked until their hands split, their backs bent, and their breath came in steam that froze on their sleeves. Imagine one of them, a soldier from Chu, far from his warm, damp home in the south. He has never seen this open sky before, this horizon where earth curves into the distance without a tree to break it. He stands on a ridge, pressing earth into a wooden frame, each thud of the tamper echoing like a heartbeat. At night, he lies under a felt blanket, listening to wolves in the dark. By day, he hears the hammer on stone, the creak of oxen dragging loads uphill, the distant cry of overseers. The wall grew not as a single clean line, but in bursts and joints. Here a tower crowned a peak, there a trench was dug to anchor a slope. In some places, it connected old state walls. In others, it leapt into new ground entirely. Each segment bore the hands of the people who made it, their sweat salted into the soil, their footprints pressed into the mortar. When at last the chain of defences stretched from the Ordo's Loop in the west toward the Bahai Sea in the east, the emperor could imagine, perhaps for the first time, a horizon held by a single thought. Fires could leap from tower to tower, warning of any movement from beyond. Gates could be closed to shut out danger. In his mind, he had drawn a line between the civilized world and the wilderness, and made it real. But the wall was also a message. To those within, it told his subjects, "This land is whole now, bound together not just by laws and coins and roads, but by this great body of stone and earth. It told them that their labor was part of something that would outlast them, something that might stand for ages beyond memory. Yet even as it rose, the seeds of its weakness were present. A wall, no matter how long, depends on the men who guard it. It depends on their loyalty, their strength, their willingness to stand against cold, hunger, and fear. And a wall so vast must always have places thinly manned, gates lightly watched, sections left to weather when resources are stretched too far. For Qin Shi Huang, the wall was both a crown and a gamble. It would define the northern frontier for centuries, but it would not be the unbreachable shield he imagined. Time and tide and horsemen would see to that. As the emperor surveyed his work, perhaps from a high tower with the wind tugging at his robes, he might have felt the satisfaction of a vision made real. Below him, the wall curved away into the distance, watchtowers pricking the skyline, beacon braziers waiting for the spark. It was a wonder, and like all wonders, it would one day be tested. The first walls taught every lesson the Great Wall would learn later at scale. That terrain is a partner. That logistics is a general. That morale can make a low bank high and a strong bastion frail. That information, a curl of smoke at the right moment, can turn a raid aside without a sword drawn. They also taught the oldest lesson, that the line between inside and outside is a living thing, shaped not only by stone and soil, but by seasons, needs, and the plain. Arithmetic of hunger. When later storytellers speak of a single serpent of masonry running from sea to desert, they compress centuries into a symbol. The truth under that symbol is quieter and more human. Villages that hauled clay in woven baskets. Overseers who measured a day's progress in paces and calloused palms. Engineers who learned how frost heaves crack an embankment and how spring thaws swallow a palisade post. The wall began as a tension made visible, a long, patient-looking north, and in time, a single wall would gather these patient glances into a stare so steady that stones seemed to grow from mountains. One ruler would imagine a border not as a row of neighbors' fences, but as an unbroken thought in the landscape. He would ask for the impossible and receive something close to it. At a cost his subjects paid with breath and bone. But that is the next turning in our quiet road. The moment a vision becomes a command, and scattered stitches begin to bind. Close your eyes and picture the early ramparts and the last light. A brown line holding a hilltop, while cranes lift off the river below. Hear a watchman's cough, the creak of leather, the small crackle of a beacon brazier, testing the evening air. The world is not yet a single wall. It is many small answers to the same question. And somewhere beyond the ridge, hoofbeats are already measuring the distance between them. Asterisk by the time the first emperor of a unified China rose to power, the land north of the Yellow River had already been stitched with walls built by different states. They were scattered, irregular, and each bore the signature of the kingdom that raised it. Zhao's earth mounds sloped differently than Yan's. Qin's timber gates swung heavier than Wei's. None of these walls connected. They stood like separate thoughts along the same horizon. Into 21 BCE, Yingzhong, king of Qin, had done what no ruler before him had achieved, brought the warring states under one crown. He renamed himself Qin Shi Huang, first August Emperor, and set about reshaping the land into a single body. Roads ran out from the capital like veins, weights and measures were made uniform, written characters standardized, but the frontier was still rugged. The emperor's mind worked onto scales at once, the immediate and the eternal. He thought like a man, who feared rebellion in the next season, and like a god who imagined his realm enduring for 10,000 generations. The north was his whirring. There, beyond the bend of the Yellow River, lay the open steppe, and on it, the Zhongnu horsemen, swift as wind, hard as frost. They could strike a border village and vanish before the imperial army even saddled its horses. Qin Shi Huang looked at the scattered walls and saw not a collection of barriers, but a single opportunity. If they could be joined, stitched with new sections, fortified with stone, anchored by watchtowers, they could form a spine to the empire's skull. It would not just protect, it would announce the new unity to friend and foe alike. The command went out. Labor was summoned from every province, soldiers, conscripts, prisoners, farmers whose fields would wait until the next planting. They came, with baskets, spades, chisels, and ropes. Some came willingly, proud to serve in this grand work. Others came because refusal was unthinkable. The work began in the west, where Qin's own walls stood. Sections that followed mountain ridges were extended, weaving toward the old lines of Zhao and Yan. The builders tamped earth where stone was scarce, laid heavy blocks where quarries were close, and cut timber from distant forests to span gullies and gate passes. The emperor's orders were relentless. The wall must rise before the year's end, before the snows, before the grass returned to feed the nomad herds. In the dry air of the north, men worked until their hands split, their backs bent, and their breath came in steam that froze on their sleeves. Imagine one of them, a soldier from Chu, far from his warm, damp home in the south. He has never seen this open sky before, this horizon where earth curves into the distance without a tree to break it. He stands on a ridge, pressing earth into a wooden frame, each thud of the tamper echoing like a heartbeat. At night, he lies under a felt blanket, listening to wolves in the dark. By day, he hears the hammer on stone, the creak of oxen dragging loads uphill. The distant cry of overseers dot the wall grew not as a single clean line, but in bursts and joints. Here a tower crowned a peak. There a trench was dug to anchor a slope. In some places, it connected old state walls. In others, it leapt into new ground entirely. Each segment bore the hands of the people who made it, their sweat salted into the soil, their footprints pressed into the mortar. When at last the chain of defences stretched from the Ordo's loop in the west toward the Bahai Sea in the east, the emperor could imagine, perhaps for the first time, a horizon held by a single thought. Fires could leap from tower to tower, warning of any movement from beyond. Gates could be closed to shut out danger. In his mind, he had drawn a line between the civilized world and the wilderness, and made it real. But the wall was also a message. To those within, it told his subjects, this land is whole now, bound together not just by laws and coins and roads, but by this great body of stone and earth. It told them that their labor was part of something that would outlast them, something that might stand for ages beyond memory. Yet even as it rose, the seeds of its weakness were present. A wall, no matter how long, depends on the men who guard it. It depends on their loyalty, their strength, their willingness to stand against cold, hunger, and fear. And a wall so vast must always have places thinly manned, gates lightly watched, sections left to weather when resources are stretched too far. For Qin Shi Huang, the wall was both a crown and a gamble. It would define the northern frontier for centuries, but it would not be the unbreachable shield he imagined. Time and tide, and horsemen, would see to that dot as the emperor surveyed his work, perhaps from a high tower with the wind tugging at his robes. He might have felt the satisfaction of a vision made real. Below him, the wall curved away into the distance, watchtowers pricking the skyline, beacon braziers waiting for the spark. It was a wonder. Unlike all wonders, it would one day be tested. The watchtower stands like a lone guardian on the spine of the wall, its square silhouette etched against the pale sky. Built of stone and brick, it is sturdy yet weathered, the corners rounded by centuries of wind. From a distance, it looks silent, almost abandoned, but inside, it is the beating heart of this section of the wall. Let us step inside and stay for a single day and night. At dawn, the light spills through the arrow slits, long and golden. The tower smells faintly of smoke from the beacon fire above, and of old straw from the sleeping mats. The soldiers wake in the dim lower chamber, rubbing the chill from their hands. One man stirs the embers in the brazier, coaxing the coals into flame to warm the morning meal. Millet porridge with a pinch of salt. The sound of spoons scraping wooden bowls is quiet, unhurried. Outside, the wind hums over the parapet. 2 men climb the ladder to the roof. From here, the wall stretches away in both directions, a pale ribbon vanishing into hills to the east, running straight toward a notch in the mountains to the west. The land beyond the wall is open and brown, dotted with the shadows of clouds. In the far distance, movement might be a herd of deer, or a scouting party. The sentries watch, scanning for anything out of place. The tower's duties are both simple and endless. At regular intervals, a sentry walks the parapet, checking for loose stones or damage from wind and rain. Another cleans the beacon brazier on the roof, making sure the fuel is dry and ready. The captain reads reports from neighboring towers, noting any signs of trouble. Messages here are short and urgent: 5 riders seen at dawn, or smoke to the north. By midday, the wind rises, rattling the banners. A supply train arrives, 2 ox-drawn carts bringing sacks of grain, oil jars, and dried vegetables. The soldiers help unload, stacking the supplies in the cool storage room. The driver stays only long enough to water his oxen before turning back toward the nearest garrison. Afternoons are quieter. Some men practice archery, loosing arrows into straw targets set against the inside wall. Others repair harnesses or mend their boots. One sits cross-legged in a patch of sunlight, carving a small wooden charm to send home. In the shade of the tower, a game of dice begins, the laughter low but warm dot as the sun dips toward the horizon. The air calls. The captain orders a final patrol along the wall's length before nightfall. 2 men walk eastward, to westward, their figures shrinking along the stone path until they are swallowed by distance. The tower settles into shadow. The beacon fuel, dry wood, reeds, and a layer of oiled straw is set in place atop the brazier, ready to light at the first sign of danger. Night changes everything. From the roof, the world beyond the wall is now a dark ocean. The moon rises, silvering the stones and catching in the arrow slits. The watch is doubled. 2 men stand on the parapet, while 2 rest inside, ready to be called. Sound travels farther now. The faint bark of a dog in a village far south, the low howl of a wolf, the distant rustle of wind through grass. Inside the tower, the brazier burns low, throwing a circle of orange light against the walls. A soldier writes a letter by its glow, the brush strokes careful, a report of good health, a memory from home, a promise to return. Another sits quietly, sharpening his spearhead, the slow scrape of stone on metal steady and soft. Hours pass like this, marked only by the change of the watch and the turning of the moon. The men speak little, their eyes and ears are fixed outward. They know that danger, if it comes, will come fast. Sometimes. Nothing happens for weeks. No riders, no smoke, only the steady rhythm of duty. And yet, the tower must always be ready for the moment when stillness breaks. A shadow moving too quickly, a spark of light where none should be, the faint thud of hooves on frozen ground. In such moments, the tower becomes a signal. One torch to the beacon brazier, and fire leaps upward, licking the night to the east. Another tower answers, then another, and another, until the horizon blooms with warning. The message races faster than any horse, carrying word to garrisons and villages alike. Danger approaches, but tonight no signal rises. The night deepens, and the cold settles into the stones. The soldiers pull their cloaks tighter and wait for dawn. When the first light comes, the land beyond the wall is unchanged, empty, quiet, wide as the sea. The tower breathes again, its day beginning as it has for centuries. The wall stretches on, and the watch continues. The wall had been built to hold the horizon, to turn raiders aside, to make the northern frontier a solid thing. But no wall, however long, is unbroken, and no guard, however watchful, can be everywhere at once. The first breach worth telling happened not with roaring armies, but with the quiet cunning of men who understood the wall's greatest weakness. It needed human hands to hold it. It was late autumn. The wind carried the dry smell of frost, and the plains beyond the wall were brittle with dying grass. The garrison in this section had been stretched thin for weeks, patrols sent east to reinforce another post, supply trains delayed by early snow. The watchtowers still stood, their beacon braziers ready, but few eyes scanned the horizon. The riders came at night, no more than a few dozen. They moved with the wind, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. They knew this stretch of the wall well, knew where the towers were far apart, where a deep gully crept close to the base, where the gate captain had a reputation for caution. And for greed. They arrived at the foot of the wall not with ladders or rams, but with a cart piled high with goods, bolts of cloth, cured meat, a pouch heavy with silver. A messenger rode ahead to the gate, calling softly in the local tongue. The captain descended from his post, lantern in hand, his breath curling in the cold air. Words were exchanged, low, measured, familiar. A gift changed hands. The gate swung open. The riders passed through without hurry, like traders with legitimate cause. Inside the wall, they split into small groups, vanishing into the darkness beyond the watchfires. By morning, they were gone, their saddlebags heavier, the villages they had passed through a little lighter. The captain filed no report. On the books, the night had been quiet, the wall had stood. But in truth, it had been crossed as easily as a stream. This was not the only way the wall failed. Sometimes, brute force was enough. In the early years, when a section was manned by tired or underfed soldiers, a sudden attack could overwhelm them before a signal could be sent. Archers from the steppe could pin down defenders, while a small force scaled the parapet with grappling hooks. A breach might last only an hour before reinforcements arrived, but an hour was long enough for raiders to disappear into the interior with horses, grain, and captives, and sometimes the wall was simply bypassed. The steppe stretched for hundreds of miles, its rivers freezing solid in winter, its valleys opening into narrow passes the wall could not cover. A determined force could circle wide, cross where the stones ended, and ride south through undefended land. The wall might still serve as a warning, but it was never an unbroken seal. The truth was that the wall's strength lay as much in the idea of it as in the stones themselves. When garrisons were strong and supply lines steady, the wall was a hard thing to challenge. When morale slipped, when bribes grew tempting, when weather or politics pulled soldiers away, the wall became a symbol without teeth. Imagine being a farmer in a village just south of the wall. You might see the towers every day, their shapes steady against the sky. You might believe, as you tilled your field, that they would keep the world beyond at bay. And then, one autumn morning, you might find hoofprints in your yard, your storehouse door swinging open, and the wall unchanged, standing in the distance as if nothing had happened. Stories of such failures traveled fast. In the markets, traders would murmur about gates that opened too easily, about night attacks that left no beacon lit. Officials would deny them, insisting the wall stood strong. But the people who lived in its shadow knew better. The wall was a line, yes, but it was also a wager, a bet placed on the loyalty and strength of those who stood upon it. And sometimes that bet did not pay. Even Qin Shi Huang's mighty work, forged with the labor of thousands, could not erase the fact that borders are as much humans as they are stone. The wall could be climbed, bribed, bypassed, or ignored, and each time it failed, it reminded the empire that a barrier is only as unyielding as the will behind it. Still, the wall endured. Repairs were made, captains replaced, gates reinforced. The breaches were patched, and the towers returned to their watch, because to abandon the wall entirely would be to admit that the frontier could not be held at all. And 4 emperors who dreamed of forever, that was unthinkable. When the Qing Dynasty fell in 206 BCE, its walls did not vanish with it. The new Han rulers inherited the long, uneven line, and with it, the same restless northern frontier. The Han were not content to merely guard what Qin Shi Huang had built. They would extend the wall deeper into the west, not only as a shield against the steppe tribes, but as a spine for something new, the Silk Road. Under Emperor Wu, the Han armies pushed outward. Their eyes were not only on the Zhonglu horsemen who still roamed the north, but on the lands beyond, the oases, mountains, and trade routes that led towards Central Asia. To hold these routes, the wall would need to grow. The Han engineers faced different challenges from those of Qin. In the far west, stone was scarce, and would scarcer still. The deserts were vast and dry, and the wind was a constant sculptor, erasing tracks, shifting dunes, and scouring anything left exposed. Here, the wall could not be made of solid stone. Instead, the Han built with tamped earth mixed with reeds, willow branches, and layers of gravel, a composite strong enough to stand against centuries of wind. The wall no longer ran only along the northern edge of farmland. It now reached into lands where farmers were few, and the nearest garrison might be weeks away. In these lonely stretches, forts and watchtowers rose every few miles, each one a small island of order in a sea of emptiness. The towers guarded more than soldiers. They protected caravans. Picture a caravan in the Han era, camels laden with silk bolts, lacquerware, and tea, moving westward toward far-off markets. In return, they would bring glass from the Roman world, fine horses from the Fergana Valley, and spices from India. The wall and its outposts became lifelines for these traders, offering water, shelter, and protection from raiders who knew the value of such goods. The soldiers who manned these western posts lived differently from their counterparts in the lush east. Supplies had to be brought over long distances, so every scrap was precious. Water came from wells or streams guarded fiercely. In the evenings, soldiers might huddle around a low fire, drinking weak tea and sharing news from the last caravan. The desert nights were sharp and cold, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Emperor Wu's expansion was not without cost. Each mile of new wall demanded labor, stone and supplies. Garrisons had to be staffed and maintained, and the further west they went, the harder it became to keep them strong. But the reward was immense. The Han could project power across vast distances, control the flow of goods, and send a clear message to allies and enemies alike. This is our land, and it is watched still. Even in the Han's strongest years, the wall could not be everywhere. The Xiongnu and other tribes adapted, learning to skirt the guarded passes and strike where defenses were thin. Some even traded openly with Han garrisons, offering horses in exchange for silk, grain, or wine. In this way, the wall became not just a military barrier, but a marketplace, a thin, shifting line where cultures met. By the end of the Han Dynasty, the wall stretched across more than 5,000 kilometers. It had grown from a local defense into an artery of empire, a structure that carried both soldiers and merchants, messages and goods. It was no longer just about keeping people out. It was about shaping the movement of people and wealth. But the Han, like the Qin before them, would eventually fall. And the wall, once a proud symbol of imperial might, would again be left to weather. The wind, parts would crumble, towers would be abandoned. Yet the idea of the wall, that long, watchful line, would remain. And in centuries to come, new rulers would breathe life into its stones once more. The wall was built for war, but it often found itself holding something more fragile: peace. In its long life, the wall was not always a place of arrows and alarms. Sometimes, it became a line of quiet exchange, a place where enemies met without drawing swords, where trade and diplomacy crossed the same gates that had once been used for battle. During the Han and in later dynasties, peace on the frontier was rarely permanent, but it was always precious. When the steppe tribes and the empire found common ground, the wall's gates would open not to armies, but to caravans. Horses, strong, enduring animals bred for the open plains, would be led through in exchange for silk, grain, tea, and wine. This trade was not charity. It was strategy. By giving the tribes goods they valued, the emperors hoped to keep their raids at bay. At certain times, the wall became part of marriage alliances. A princess from the empire might be sent to wed a chieftain beyond the frontier, bringing with her carts of treasures. Such unions were meant to seal treaties, to bind two worlds together through family. The wall would stand between them still, but its gates would remember the days when banners of welcome flew where shields once stood. Yet peace was always fragile. The same gate that welcomed a caravan one season might brace for an attack the next. A drought on the steppe could drive herds south in search of grazing land, and with them, warriors unwilling to wait for slow negotiations. A shift in leadership, a young chieftain eager to prove himself, or an emperor determined to show strength, could turn trade routes back into battlegrounds. In these tense times, the wall was both shield and stage. Watchtowers flared with signal fires, not to call for war, but to pass along news. A large hunting party spotted near the border, a council of chiefs gathering beyond the horizon. Garrison captains would prepare for either outcome or greeting or defense, because on the frontier, the two could change places in a heartbeat. For the soldiers stationed here, this uncertainty shaped their lives. One month, they might see merchants from distant lands. hear foreign tongues in the market just south of the wall, and taste strange spices from faraway kitchens. The next month, they might stand on the parapet with bows strung, scanning the plains for dust clouds that meant riders were coming. Villages near the wall learned to live in this shifting balance. Markets grew beside certain gates, selling to both soldiers and traders. Blacksmiths repaired weapons for the garrison and shod horses for passing caravans. Children grew up hearing stories from travelers, tales of deserts, mountains, and cities they would never see. In these moments, the wall felt less like a barrier and more like a meeting place. But when the balance broke, the change was swift. Banners of welcome were taken down, gates were barred. The smell of cooking fires in the market gave way to the sharper scent of oil for weapons. The soldiers who had shared tea with traders might, within weeks, face them as enemies. This was the nature of the frontier, a place where peace was always a guest, never a permanent resident. The wall could stand for centuries, but its role could change in a single season. It was both a bridge and a border, both a handshake and a clenched fist. And so, the wall endured as more than just a defense. It was a witness to the cycles of history, times of calm when its stones felt the warmth of market fires, and times of violence when those same stones shook under the thunder of hooves. By the 13th century, the wall had already stood for more than 1,000 years, in one form or another. Dynasties had risen and fallen. Armies had tested its stones. But no enemy had yet matched the speed, endurance, and sheer adaptability of the Mongols. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, the Mongol armies were unlike anything the wall had faced before. They were not bound by fixed roads or seasonal campaigns. They could ride 4 days without stopping, surviving on dried meat and fermented mare's milk, their horses grazing as they moved. Each warrior carried several mounts, switching between them to keep the pace unbroken. The wall, in theory, should have been a barrier, but the Mongols understood its nature too well. They knew that a wall this long could not be guarded with equal strength along its entire length. They knew that gates could be bribed, that garrisons could be distracted, that distant sections could be bypassed entirely. When they attacked, it was rarely in one place. A small force might strike a well-defended gate to hold the garrison's attention, while another rode far to the east or west, finding a weaker crossing. In some cases, they waited until the rivers froze in winter, riding across the ice where no wall stood, then circling south to attack from behind. The Mongols also used diplomacy as a weapon. They would offer peace and trade to one section of the frontier while preparing to strike another. Some garrisons welcomed them as partners, exchanging goods, news, and even military assistance against rival tribes. Others learned too late that the treaty they trusted was only a pause before an invasion. When the Mongols finally breached the wall in force, it was not with the slow grind of siege engines, but with the sudden rush of mounted archers. Arrows fell like rain, forcing defenders to keep their heads low, while ladders were raised against the parapets. Once a single section fell, the Mongols could pour through, spreading out in all directions. For the farmers and towns south of the wall, the experience was terrifying. One day, the towers stood quiet. The next, dust clouds on the horizon meant that the fastest army in the world was already at their gates. The wall could slow the Mongols, but it could not stop them entirely. When the Yuan dynasty was established, under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, the wall entered one of its quieter periods. Now the rulers of China and the masters of the steppe were the same people. The wall no longer needed to guard against Mongol riders, because the Mongols were within it. Yet this peace was uneasy. The wall still stood, weathering wind and time, its watchtowers empty in some places, repurposed in others. It had not failed entirely. It had simply been bypassed by the sweep of history. And when the Yuan dynasty eventually weakened, the wall would once again face the chaos of shifting powers on the frontier. The Mongols had proven something no previous enemy had, that speed, coordination, and adaptability could turn even the mightiest wall into just another obstacle on the road to conquest. For all its strength, the wall was still only as powerful as the men who stood upon it. And the Mongols had shown that even the tallest stones could be outflanked by a shadow that moved faster than the eye could follow. By the 14th century, the Mongol Yuan dynasty had fallen, replaced by the Ming. The new rulers were determined to restore Han Chinese control over the empire's borders, and to ensure that the disasters of the past would not be repeated. For them, the Great Wall was not just an old defense to be repaired. It was to be remade, stronger and more permanent than ever before. The Ming emperors poured resources into this vision. What earlier dynasties had often left as tamped earth or loosely stacked stone, the Ming rebuilt in solid brick and quarried stone blocks. These new walls were taller, wider, and more resistant to weather and time. In some places, to soldiers could ride horseback side by side along the top. In others, the parapet was broad enough for carts to pass. This was the wall most people imagine today, its grey brick sides rising clean and precise, its battlements casting sharp shadows in the morning light. The Ming builders added crenellations for archers, drainage systems to prevent water damage, and stone steps that climbed steeply along the mountain ridges. The work was immense. Garrisons swelled with labourers, masons and soldiers. Quarry sites rang with the strike of chisels. Entire villages were conscripted to haul bricks, gravel and timber. Roads were cut through difficult terrain just to move materials to the wall's construction sites. The Ming also built new watchtowers and signal stations at regular intervals, closer together than before, so messages could pass from one to another in moments. In some stretches, towers were visible in both directions, each within the line of sight of the next. This network was vital, for the Ming faced a familiar enemy, the resurgent Mongols. But the Ming Wall was not just military. It was also a statement, a vast monument of stone, declaring the empire's strength. Travelers approaching from the north would see its ridges running 4 miles over the hills, and know they were nearing a power that had invested decades into holding this line. Inside the wall, garrisons became small towns. Markets grew to serve soldiers and their families, selling rice, vegetables, and meat alongside weapons and tools. Blacksmiths, tailors, and innkeepers found steady work. Some watchtowers doubled as storage for grain and supplies, ensuring the soldiers could endure long winters without resupply. Yet even the Ming rebuild had its limits. The wall was strongest near the political heart of the empire, especially around Beijing, where it climbed spectacularly through the mountains. Farther west, resources thinned, and the wall returned to simpler forms, still impressive, but more vulnerable. Raiders who knew the land could find these weaker stretches, slipping past when patrols were light. Despite this, the Ming Wall represented the height of the Great Wall's engineering. In the cold mornings, when frost clung to the battlements and the sun broke over the peaks, the wall felt alive, a living defense stretching beyond the eye's reach. At night, the glow of beacon fires dotted the horizon, a chain of light against the darkness. The Ming would hold the wall for nearly 3 centuries. But as always, the true test would not come from time or weather. It would come from the day an enemy found a way not to tear the wall down, but to walk through its gates. The Great Wall had been rebuilt, strengthened, and manned by the Ming for centuries. It had faced raids, sieges, and storms, and each time it had endured. But in the middle of the 17th century, it would meet its undoing not through brute force, but through the oldest weakness in any defense, the choices of men. To the northeast, beyond the wall, the Manchus had risen to power. Skilled warriors, disciplined and organized, they were more than just another frontier threat. Their goal was not to raid the Ming lands, it was to rule them. For years, the Ming garrisons along the wall held them back, fighting skirmishes in the mountain passes, keeping the gates shut tight. But in 1644, the Ming faced a greater crisis. In the heart of their empire, rebellion had broken out. Li Zikang, a former minor official turned rebel leader, swept through the countryside with his forces, capturing city after city. By spring, his army was at the gates of Beijing itself. Inside the capital, the Ming emperor saw no escape. As Li's forces closed in, the emperor retreated to the forbidden city's inner halls. On April 25, 1644, he took his own life, leaving the throne empty and the empire in chaos. At the Shanhai Pass, one of the most important gateways through the wall, where the mountains met the sea, the Ming general Wu Songui commanded a strong garrison. He now faced an impossible choice. Behind him, the rebel army of Li Zikang had seized Beijing. Beyond the wall, the Manchu army waited, watching. Wu Songui was caught between two enemies. The rebels had taken the Ming capital, but had not yet secured the empire. The Manchus, on the other hand, offered an alliance, but only if we opened the gate. In the days that followed, politics, personal grievances, and survival instincts tangled together. One story says Wu's decision was influenced by the capture of his family by the rebels. Another claims it was a calculated move to hold on to power under new rulers. In the end, Wu Songui chose. He opened the Shanhai Pass to the Manchus. The Manchu forces poured through, their banners snapping in the wind. Together with Wu's troops, they marched west toward Beijing. Within weeks, Li Zikang's rebel government collapsed. The Manchus entered the city, declared the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, and took the throne of China. The wall, which had stood against the Manchus for decades, had not been broken. Its gates had simply been unlocked. This was the cruel irony of the Great Wall's history. For centuries, emperors had poured resources into making it an unassailable line. They had raised towers, reinforced gates, and stationed armies along its length, yet again and again. Its greatest defeats came not from its stones crumbling, but from decisions made by the people who controlled it. For the Qing rulers, the wall was no longer a barrier, but a part of their realm. They maintained some sections, let others fade, and relied more on political control than on fortifications to hold their empire together. The wall's military importance waned, but its shadow in history only grew. Standing at the Shanhai Pass, today, where the wall meets the Bahai Sea, the stones still rise, solid and silent. The battlements still face outward, toward the open plains. But the lesson of 1644 lingers. Even the longest, strongest wall cannot guard against the turn of a key. After the Manchus took Beijing in 1644 and the Qing Dynasty began, the Great Wall entered a new chapter, one not of constant battles and hurried repairs, but of long, quiet neglect. The Qing rulers were not outsiders raiding from beyond the frontier anymore. They were the emperors of China. The wall no longer marked the border between their people and their enemies. Instead, it became just another feature of the landscape, impressive but unnecessary to their military plans. In the early years of Qing rule, some garrisons remained, especially near important passes. Soldiers patrolled short stretches and maintained beacon towers, but fewer and fewer messages flashed from fire to fire. Trade and diplomacy replaced the need for constant watch. The wall that had once been tense with the readiness of war now often stood empty, its stones warmed by the sun and cooled by the night, with no footsteps to disturb them. As decades passed, nature began to reclaim what man had built. In the mountains, grass and wildflowers pushed through the cracks in the stonework. In the desert, the wind ate at the earthen walls, softening their edges until they looked more like low hills than fortifications. Watchtowers leaned under the weight of their own age, their roofs collapsing inward, their bricks scattered in the dirt. Villages near the wall saw opportunity in its decay. Fallen stones became foundations for houses, bricks became hearths, and flat slabs were used for animal pens or village wells. The wall's body was slowly carried away, piece by piece, into the lives of the people who had once lived under its protection. Travelers who came upon the wall in these centuries often found it half hidden, a quiet companion to their journey, rather than a barrier to be feared. A merchant leading his mules west might walk beside it for a day without seeing another soul. A shepherd might tie his flock near a crumbling watchtower, letting the sheep graze among the stones, and yet, even in its sleep, the wall still carried stories. The villagers who lived in its shadow spoke of the battles their grandparents had heard about, of the emperors who had sent armies to guard its gates, of the generals who had defended it with their lives. The wall was no longer the empire's shield, but it remained a memory carved into the land itself. By the 19th century, foreign travelers began to take interest in the Great Wall again. To them, it was a wonder, a relic from an age when human ambition could stretch for thousands of miles. They sketched its ruins, measured its height, and marveled at its sheer length. In their journals, they described walking along broken paths where the stones were worn smooth, where only the cry of a hawk and the whisper of the wind kept them company. But for most of the Qing era, the wall's role was not to defend, but to endure. It became a sleeping giant, its strength buried beneath centuries of peace and disuse. And though its towers no longer blazed with warning fires, they still watched over the land in their own silent way, weathered, patient, and waiting. The wall had always been more than just a military fortification. It was a line drawn by human will, a promise made by emperors to their people. And even in its long sleep, it kept that promise in spirit, to stand, to last, to witness. By the 19th century, China stood at a crossroads. The Ming Dynasty still ruled, but its hold was weakening under the weight of internal rebellion, economic strain, and growing pressure from foreign powers. In this time of change, the Great Wall, long ignored by its own rulers, began to draw the attention of outsiders. Foreign explorers and scholars had heard rumors of the wall, a fortification said to stretch farther than any in human history, winding over mountains, deserts, and plains. For many in Europe and beyond, it sounded almost like a legend, something half believed, like the walls of Troy or the roads of Rome, when they finally saw it with their own eyes. It was not a perfect ribbon of stone, but a series of broken lines, some parts solid and proud, others weathered into the earth. Yet this only deepened its mystery. Travelers sketched what they saw, their drawings showing watchtowers perched on narrow ridges, walls plunging into valleys, and crumbling parapets standing against the sky. They wrote of walking along sections so narrow they felt as if they were balancing on the spine of the world, the wind tugging at their coats. They measured the height of its stones, counted the paces between towers, and marveled that such a thing had been built at all. But not all foreign encounters were peaceful. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as foreign armies pushed into China during conflicts like the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion, the wall became part of the backdrop to invasion. Soldiers passed through its gates not as honored guests, but as conquerors. In some places, bricks were taken for military camps, and watchtowers were repurposed as lookouts for entirely new wars. Yet even as China's sovereignty suffered, the wall's presence in the Western imagination grew. Writers began to speak of it as one of the great wonders of the world, not just for its size, but for what it represented, the ambition and endurance of an ancient civilization. It became a symbol of China itself, even if the Chinese government of the time saw it as little more than an old ruin. Photographers, carrying heavy glass plates and bulky cameras, captured its silhouette in the early morning light. Their images traveled across oceans, appearing in books and exhibitions. For many in the West, these photographs were their first true glimpse of the Great Wall, a structure at once majestic and crumbling, timeless and vulnerable. For the people living near it, little changed. Farmers still took stones for their homes, children still played in the shadows of its towers, and herders still used the wall as a marker for grazing boundaries. But they began to notice more strangers passing through, people with strange accents, wearing unfamiliar clothes, staring at the wall as if it were a miracle. The wall, once a shield and then a sleeping monument, was becoming something new, a subject of curiosity, a bridge between cultures, and, slowly, a piece of shared human heritage. But it would take the next century, and a new China, for the wall to wake again and step into the modern world. The dawn of the 20th century brought immense change to China. The Ming Dynasty, after more than 2 centuries of rule, collapsed in 1911. The country shifted through warlordism, civil war, and foreign invasion. In those turbulent decades, the Great Wall stood quietly, neither defended nor fully abandoned, a reminder of the past in a country struggling to define its future. For much of the early 1900s, the wall was seen less as a symbol of national pride and more as a relic, a thing of stone too ancient to be useful. Many sections continued to crumble. Bricks were taken by villagers, or even by military forces, to build barracks and roads. In some remote stretches, entire watchtowers disappeared into the walls of new houses. During the Second Sino-Japanese War 1937 to 1945, parts of the wall became strategic positions once again. Soldiers used its towers for observation posts, and its high ridges provided natural defense lines. But these moments were brief, and war's destruction only added to the damage already done by centuries of neglect. After the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the new government faced the enormous task of rebuilding a country dead by war. In the early years, the wall was not a priority. The focus was on industry, agriculture, and unifying the nation. Yet the wall remained in the background, its silhouette on stamps, in school books, and in the minds of the people as a symbol of China's endurance. It wasn't until the latter half of the 20th century that the wall began to emerge as a national treasure. Leaders realized that it was more than just old stones. It was a unifying emblem, a physical connection to the shared history of the Chinese people. The slogan, "He who has not climbed the Great Wall is not a true hero," became famous, drawing citizens and tourists alike to its slopes. Restoration projects began in earnest. In the 1950s and 60s, key sections near Beijing, such as Badaling, were rebuilt for visitors. The work was careful in some places, hurried in others, but the intent was clear. The wall was no longer to be left to crumble. It would stand as a monument to Chinese history and determination. By the late 20th century, the Great Wall had become one of the most recognizable landmarks in the world. It appeared in films, books, and television. School children visited on field trips, climbing its steep steps, while their teachers told stories of the emperors and generals who once walked the same path. Foreign tourists came in ever greater numbers, cameras in hand, eager to see the stone serpent winding over the mountains. The wall had moved from neglect into the heart of the nation's identity. No longer just a fortress or a ruin, it was now a symbol of endurance, unity, and the ability of a civilization to survive the passing of centuries. And yet, even in this modern revival, the truth remained. The wall had never been perfect. It had never kept everyone out. What it had done, and continued to do, was stand as a witness to the rise and fall of powers, the meeting of cultures, and the endurance of human ambition. Today, the Great Wall is no longer a military defense. It is a monument, a heritage, site, and for many, a dream to walk upon. Tourists arrive from every corner of the world, eager to stand on its stones and trace their fingers along its weathered edges. They climb its steep steps, pause to catch their breath, and gaze out over the rolling mountains or the empty desert, seeing much the same view that soldiers once guarded centuries ago. In the most famous sections, like Badaling and Mutianyu near Beijing, the wall is carefully restored. Its bricks fit neatly, its towers stand tall, and its paths are lined with visitors taking photographs. Vendors sell water and souvenirs, and the air is filled with a mix of voices from different languages. These stretches are vibrant with life, not the life of armies, but of people connecting across cultures. Far from the tourist hubs, other sections tell a different story. In the mountains of Hebei or the deserts of Gansu, the wall stands in quiet solitude. Here, the bricks are worn, the parapets broken, and the paths sometimes lost to the grass. Few travelers find their way to these places, and those who do often walk alone, with only the wind and the sound of their footsteps. Preservation is a challenge. Time, weather, and human activity continue to wear the wall down. Some parts crumble from neglect, others from overuse. Conservationists work to balance the need to protect it with the desire for people to experience it. The Great Wall is vast, too vast to save every stone, but efforts are underway to keep its most endangered sections from disappearing entirely. Its legacy, however, is not just in its stones. The wall's true power lies in the story it tells of centuries of ambition, struggle, and endurance. It speaks of emperors who dreamed of absolute security, of soldiers who stood watch through bitter winters, of traders and travelers who crossed its gates, of moments when it held firm and moments when it failed. The wall could not keep everyone out, and perhaps that is part of its deeper meaning. No wall, however strong, can stop the flow of history. People find ways over, under, or through. Borders shift, alliances change. What remains is not the barrier itself, but the memory of why it was built. and the human will it represents in the soft light of dawn, when the tourists have not yet arrived, and the wall lies quiet under the pale sky. It is easy to imagine the centuries folding into one another. The same wind that brushes your face once carried the smell of campfires from soldiers' tents. The same stones beneath your feet once shook with the thunder of hooves, and as the sun rises higher, the wall stretches on, across ridges and valleys, across history and imagination, a line that has outlived the empires it was built to defend. Its legacy is not in keeping the world out, but in standing long enough to remind us that every defense, no matter how mighty, becomes a part of the world it sought to separate.